Greetings, listeners, and welcome back to Scary Stories. Get ready for more chilling tales that will haunt your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and join us on this journey into the unknown. Let's dive right in. The Mirror's Reflection. My name is Liam, and I never believed in the supernatural until I experienced it firsthand. It all started when I moved into a new apartment. A small but charming place with antique fixtures and creaky wooden floors. The previous tenant had left behind an old, ornate mirror in the bedroom. I decided to keep it, thinking it added character to the room. At first, everything seemed normal. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd. My reflection in the mirror seemed delayed, like it was moving just a fraction of a second behind me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a trick of the light or my imagination. Over the next few days, the delay in the reflection became more pronounced. I would wave my hand, and my reflection would follow a moment later. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just a flaw in the mirror. Then, one night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint whispering coming from the direction of the mirror. I got out of bed and approached it, and to my horror, I saw my reflection standing there, staring back at me with an eerie smile. It moved closer to the glass, its lips forming words I couldn't hear. Terrified, I covered the mirror with a sheet and tried to go back to sleep. But the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I could hear my reflection calling my name, begging me to uncover the mirror and look at it. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I took it to the basement, hoping to leave it behind for good. But that night, I heard the whispering again, this time coming from the basement. I could hear my reflection pleading with me, telling me it was trapped and needed my help. I tried to ignore it, but the whispering grew louder and more desperate. I could feel the presence of my reflection, lurking just out of sight, watching me. I started having nightmares, seeing myself trapped in the mirror, unable to escape. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the basement and uncovered the mirror. My reflection stood there, looking at me with a mix of relief and malice. It reached out its hand, and I felt a cold, clammy touch on my own hand. Suddenly, I was pulled into the mirror. I found myself in a dark, twisted version of my apartment, with no way out. My reflection stepped out of the mirror, taking my place in the real world. I screamed, but no sound came out. Now, I'm trapped in the mirror, watching helplessly as my reflection lives my life. It looks just like me, but I can see the malice in its eyes. It's only a matter of time before it starts causing havoc, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. If you ever come across an old mirror, be careful. You never know what might be lurking on the other side, waiting for a chance to take your place. The Unseen Roommate. My name is Ryan, and I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. But after what I experienced, I can't deny the existence of something beyond our understanding. It all started when I moved into a new apartment with my friend, Mike. It was a great place, spacious and affordable, with a view of the city skyline. We were excited to start our new lives there. The first few weeks were uneventful. We settled in, decorated the place, and hosted a few parties. But then, strange things started happening. It began with small things. Doors would be open when we were sure we had closed them, and items would go missing only to reappear in odd places. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Mike, but when I got up to check, his door was closed, and he was sound asleep. I shrugged it off as my imagination and went back to bed. The next morning, Mike mentioned that he had been hearing strange noises at night as well. We joked about the apartment being haunted, but neither of us really believed it. However, the noises continued, and they became more frequent and louder. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard whispering. It was faint, but I could make out voices, speaking in hushed tones. I got up and followed the sound to the living room, but there was no one there. The voices stopped as soon as I entered the room. I started to feel like we weren't alone in the apartment. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, and I felt a constant sense of being watched. Mike experienced the same things, and we both became increasingly uneasy. We decided to set up a camera in the living room, hoping to capture whatever was causing the disturbances. The next morning, we reviewed the footage, and what we saw sent chills down our spines. There was a figure, barely visible, moving around the room. It was tall and thin, with indistinct features, and it seemed to be watching us. We contacted the building management, but they couldn't find any explanation for the disturbances. We considered moving out, but breaking the lease would have been expensive, and we hoped the situation would resolve itself. One night, I woke up to find the figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was closer now, its features more defined. I could see hollow eyes and a twisted smile. I screamed, and the figure vanished. Mike rushed in, and I told him what had happened. We both agreed that we needed to leave the apartment as soon as possible. We moved out the next day, leaving most of our belongings behind. The sense of relief was immense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had followed us. I started having nightmares, seeing the figure in my dreams, always watching me. A few months later, Mike and I heard that the new tenants in our old apartment had experienced similar disturbances. They too had moved out, unable to cope with the constant feeling of being watched. I don't know what the figure was or why it chose to haunt us, but I've come to believe that some places are cursed, and the spirits that reside there are bound to it, unable to find peace. If you ever feel like you're being watched, trust your instincts and leave. Some things are better left unseen. The Haunting of Hallow Hill. My name is Caleb, and I grew up in a small town with a dark secret. On the outskirts of town, there was an old, abandoned house known as Hallow Hill. It was a place of local legend, said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died there under mysterious circumstances. As kids, my friends and I would dare each other to go to Hallow Hill. Most of us were too scared to venture beyond the front gate, but there were always stories of those who had braved the house and never been the same afterward. One summer, my friend Jack and I decided to explore Hallow Hill. We were 15, and we thought we were invincible. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, we made our way to the house one evening. The house was even more foreboding up close. Its windows were shattered, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The air was thick with dust, and an eerie silence enveloped us. We explored the first floor, finding nothing but old furniture and remnants of a life long gone. But as we made our way upstairs, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and we could hear faint whispers, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. In one of the bedrooms, we found a journal. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the house many years ago. Her entries detailed strange occurrences, voices in the night, objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread. As we read the journal, we heard a loud bang coming from downstairs. We froze, our hearts pounding. Jack whispered that we should leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to find out what had caused the noise. We made our way back downstairs, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. In the living room, we saw a figure standing by the fireplace. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She looked at us with a mixture of sadness and anger. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she began to move towards us, her movements slow and deliberate. Jack grabbed my arm, and we ran out of the house, not stopping until we were back in town. We told our friends what had happened, but no one believed us. They thought we were making it up to scare them. But Jack and I knew what we had seen. The woman in the house was real, and she was haunting Hallow Hill. Over the years, I've tried to forget about that night, but the memory still haunts me. I've done some research, and I found out that Elena had died under mysterious circumstances. Some say she was murdered, while others believe she took her own life. I believe her spirit is trapped in the house, unable to move on, and anyone who dares to enter Hallow Hill is at risk of encountering her restless soul. If you ever find yourself near that old house, stay away. Some places are better left undisturbed, and the spirits that haunt them are best left alone. The Forgotten Child. My name is Sam, and I used to work as a night security guard at an old hospital that had been converted into office buildings. The place had a long and grim history, having served as a mental asylum in the early 1900s. There were always stories about the place being haunted, but I never believed in any of that until I experienced it for myself. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. It was usually quiet, with only the occasional cleaning crew or late working employee passing through. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a child's laughter echoing through the empty halls. I thought it was strange, but I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. As I continued my patrol, the laughter grew louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the old wing of the hospital, which had been closed off for renovations. Curious and a bit unnerved, I decided to investigate. I made my way to the old wing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was colder there, and the atmosphere felt heavy, almost oppressive. I followed the sound of the laughter to a room at the end of the hall. Inside, I saw a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, standing by the window. She had long, dark hair and was wearing an old-fashioned dress. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were filled with sadness. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm lost," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you help me find my mommy?" My heart ached for the little girl, but something about the situation felt wrong. There shouldn't have been any children in the building, especially not in the old wing. I approached her slowly, but as I got closer, she vanished, leaving me standing in an empty room. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination. I tried to forget about it, but the girl's sad eyes haunted me. Over the next few weeks, I continued to hear the laughter and see glimpses of the little girl in the old wing. Each time, she would ask me to help her find her mommy, and each time, she would vanish before I could get close. I started researching the history of the hospital and discovered that a young girl named Emily had died there in the 1920s. She had been admitted to the asylum with her mother, who had been deemed unfit to care for her. Emily had died under mysterious circumstances, and her mother had disappeared shortly afterward. I became convinced that the little girl I was seeing was Emily's spirit, trapped in the hospital, searching for her mother. I wanted to help her, but I didn't know how. One night, I decided to try and communicate with her. I went to the old wing and called out to her, telling her that I wanted to help. She appeared, standing in the same spot by the window. "I'm here to help you, Emily," I said. "Tell me what you need." She looked at me with those sad eyes and said, "I want to find my mommy." "I'll help you," I promised, "but you have to show me where to look." She nodded and led me down the hall to a door I had never noticed before. It was locked, but I managed to force it open. Inside, I found an old storage room filled with dusty files and equipment. In the corner, I saw a small, unmarked grave. Emily pointed to the grave and said, "She's here." My heart broke as I realized that Emily's mother had been buried in the hospital, her death covered up and forgotten. I contacted the authorities, and they exhumed the remains, finally giving Emily and her mother a proper burial. After that night, I never saw Emily again. The laughter stopped, and the old wing no longer felt oppressive. I believe that by finding her mother, I helped Emily find peace. Working in that old hospital taught me that some spirits are trapped, unable to move on until they find what they're looking for. And sometimes, all they need is for someone to listen and help them find their way. The Watcher in the Woods. My name is Jake, and I grew up in a small town surrounded by dense forests. As kids, we were always told to stay out of the woods after dark, but we never took those warnings seriously. That all changed after my experience one summer night. I was 17, and my friends and I had decided to go camping in the woods. We found a clearing not too far from the edge of the forest and set up our tents. We spent the evening telling ghost stories around the campfire, laughing and trying to scare each other. As the night went on, we started hearing strange noises coming from deeper in the woods. It sounded like someone walking, but when we shone our flashlights in that direction, we couldn't see anything. We joked about it being the Watcher, a local legend about a mysterious figure that supposedly lived in the woods and watched anyone who ventured too far. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. I was sharing a tent with my friend, Tom, and we were both drifting off to sleep when we heard it again, the sound of footsteps, closer this time. We whispered to each other, trying to decide if we should investigate or stay put. Curiosity got the better of us, and we grabbed our flashlights and quietly unzipped the tent. The footsteps had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent. We stepped out into the clearing, our lights sweeping through the darkness. That's when we saw him, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. He was watching us, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step closer, and we could see that it wasn't human. Its features were distorted, like a twisted version of a person. It moved with an unnatural grace, almost gliding across the ground. We turned and ran back to the tent, our fear overriding any sense of rationality. We woke up our friends and told them what we had seen. They laughed at first, thinking we were playing a prank, but when they saw the terror in our eyes, they knew we were serious. We decided to pack up and leave, not wanting to spend another minute in those woods. As we hurried to gather our things, we heard the footsteps again, circling the clearing, getting closer. We could feel the Watcher's eyes on us, and it felt like we were being hunted. We finally made it back to town, breathless and shaken. We told our parents what had happened, and they scolded us for going into the woods at night. But I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew the legends, and they believed us. That night changed us. We never went back into the woods after dark, and we warned others to stay away as well. The Watcher was real, and he was always there, waiting in the darkness, watching. Years later, I still have nightmares about that night. I see the Watcher's glowing eyes, feel his gaze on me, and wake up in a cold sweat. Some things are best left unexplored, and some legends are more than just stories. The shadow at the end of the hall. My name is David, and I used to live in an old, creaky house that had been in my family for generations. The house had a lot of history, and with it came a lot of strange occurrences that I couldn't explain. One of the most unsettling experiences happened when I was in my late 20s. I had just moved back in with my parents after a rough breakup, and I was staying in my old bedroom at the end of the hall. The house had always had its quirks, noises in the night, doors opening on their own, but I had grown used to it over the years. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard footsteps coming down the hall. I assumed it was one of my parents, but when I called out, there was no response. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and I felt a sudden chill. I got up and opened the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but I could feel a presence, like someone was standing just out of sight. I closed the door and went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps became a nightly occurrence. They would start at the far end of the hall and slowly make their way to my door, stopping just outside. I tried to ignore it, but the sense of dread grew stronger each night. One evening, My parents went out for dinner, and I was alone in the house. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard the footsteps again, louder this time. They seemed more deliberate, like whoever or whatever was making them wanted to be heard. I decided to confront whatever was causing the noise. I opened my door and walked down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel the presence growing stronger. At the end of the hall, I saw a shadowy figure. It was tall and indistinct, its features blurred and shrouded in darkness. I called out, demanding to know who it was, but there was no response. The figure just stood there, watching me. I took a step closer, and the figure vanished, leaving me standing in the cold, empty hall. I felt a rush of fear and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the footsteps again, this time running down the hall towards my door. The door handle rattled, and I could hear heavy breathing on the other side. I backed away, my mind racing with fear. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped, and the house was silent once more. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They were concerned but skeptical, thinking it was just stress from the breakup. But I knew what I had experienced was real. I started doing some research and discovered that a distant relative had died in the house many years ago. He had been found at the end of the hall, his body twisted and broken. There were rumors that he had been driven mad by something in the house, but no one knew for sure. I began to believe that the shadowy figure was his restless spirit, trapped in the house, unable to move on. I tried to communicate with him, hoping to find a way to help him find peace, but the footsteps and the presence continued. Eventually, I moved out of the house, unable to live with a constant fear. My parents still live there, and they've reported hearing the footsteps and feeling the presence, but they've grown used to it. I've come to accept that some spirits are bound to the places they died, unable to find peace. If you ever find yourself in an old house with a dark history, be wary. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. The Dollmaker's Curse. My name is Alex, and I used to work as a caretaker for an old, abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion had been empty for decades, and it was my job to make sure it didn't fall into complete disrepair. Little did I know, the mansion held a dark secret that would haunt me forever. The mansion had once belonged to a man named Victor, a renowned dollmaker known for his lifelike creations. He had lived there with his wife and daughter, but they had all mysteriously disappeared many years ago. The locals said the mansion was cursed, but I didn't believe in such things. One evening, while making my rounds, I noticed a room I had never seen before. It was hidden behind a large bookshelf that had somehow moved on its own. Inside, I found dozens of dolls, each one more lifelike than the last. They were all posed as if frozen in the middle of some activity, reading, sewing, playing. In the center of the room was a large, ornate dollhouse, a perfect replica of the mansion. As I approached it, I felt a sudden chill, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about the dollhouse felt wrong, like it was watching me. I decided to leave the room, but as I turned to go, I heard a faint whispering. I looked around, but there was no one there. The dolls seemed to be staring at me, their glassy eyes following my every move. I locked the room and tried to put it out of my mind, but that night, I had terrible nightmares. I dreamed of the dollmaker, his eyes wild and desperate, working feverishly on his creations. I could hear his voice, whispering incantations, and the dolls coming to life, their expressions twisted and malevolent. The next day, I returned to the mansion, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. I went back to the hidden room and examined the dollhouse more closely. Inside, I saw tiny figures that looked just like Victor and his family, frozen in poses of fear and despair. I realized then that the dolls were not just creations, they were people, trapped by some dark magic. Victor had somehow transferred their souls into the dolls, binding them to the mansion forever. As I stood there, the whispering grew louder, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned to see one of the dolls, a little girl, standing behind me. Her eyes were filled with terror, and she seemed to be pleading for help. I ran from the room, but the dolls seemed to follow me, their tiny footsteps echoing through the halls. I could hear Victor's voice, growing more frantic, as if he was trying to complete some unfinished task. I knew I had to do something to break the curse. I returned to the hidden room and found a book of spells among Victor's belongings. It detailed how he had used dark magic to trap the souls of his family in the dolls, hoping to preserve them forever. With trembling hands, I read through the book, searching for a way to undo the spell. I found a passage that described a ritual to release the trapped souls, but it required a great sacrifice. I gathered the ingredients and performed the ritual, chanting the words written in the book. As I finished, the dolls began to tremble, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. I could hear their voices, crying out in anguish. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash, and the dolls collapsed, lifeless. I felt a wave of relief, knowing that I had freed the trapped souls. But as I turned to leave, I saw Victor standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with rage. "You've ruined everything," he screamed, and before I could react, he lunged at me. I woke up in the hospital, my body battered and bruised. They told me I had been found unconscious in the mansion, but they couldn't explain what had happened. I never returned to the mansion, and I left my job as a caretaker. But I still have nightmares about that place, about the dolls and the curse that bound them. If you ever come across an old, abandoned mansion, be wary of what you might find. Some secrets are best left buried, and some curses can never be broken. The Phantom of Ravenswood Manor. My name is Ethan, and I used to be a tour guide at Ravenswood Manor, a grand old estate with a reputation for being haunted. The manor had been the home of the Ravenswood family for generations, and it was said that the spirits of the family members still roamed the halls. I never believed in ghosts, but I enjoyed telling the spooky stories to the tourists. It added to the allure of the place and made my job more interesting. But one summer, I experienced something that made me a believer. It started when I was giving a late-night tour. The group was small, just a few people who were fascinated by the manor's dark history. As we walked through the grand hall, I noticed a shadowy figure standing at the top of the staircase. At first, I thought it was one of the other guides playing a prank, but when I called out, the figure vanished. The tourists were excited, thinking they had seen a ghost. I tried to play it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we continued the tour, I heard whispers, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. The others heard it too, and they started to get nervous. We made our way to the library, a room filled with old books and antique furniture. As I was telling the story of Lady Ravenswood, who was said to haunt the manor, the room grew cold, and the lights flickered. I saw the shadowy figure again, standing by the fireplace, watching us. One of the tourists, a woman named Sarah, asked if we could leave. She said she felt a presence and didn't want to stay any longer. I agreed, and we hurried through the rest of the tour, the sense of unease growing stronger with each step. After the tour ended, I went to the security office to check the cameras. I wanted to see if I could find any evidence of the figure I had seen. As I reviewed the footage, I saw the shadowy figure appear in several rooms, always just out of reach, always watching. I decided to do some research into the history of the manor. I discovered that Lady Ravenswood had died under mysterious circumstances. She was found at the bottom of the grand staircase, her neck broken. Some said she had been pushed, while others believed she had fallen accidentally. I began to believe that Lady Ravenswood's spirit was still in the manor, seeking justice or revenge for her untimely death. I wanted to help her find peace, but I didn't know how. One night, I stayed late at the manor, hoping to communicate with Lady Ravenswood. I went to the grand hall and called out to her, asking her to show herself. The air grew cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I saw the shadowy figure at the top of the staircase, and this time she spoke. "Help me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "How can I help you?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Find the truth," she said, and then she vanished. I spent the next few weeks digging through old records and interviewing former staff members. I discovered that Lady Ravenswood's husband had been having an affair, and there were rumors that he had pushed her down the stairs to be with his lover. I presented my findings to the local authorities, and they reopened the case. With the new evidence, they concluded that Lady Ravenswood's death was indeed a murder. Her husband was long dead, but the truth finally came to light. After the case was closed, the strange occurrences at the manor stopped. I never saw the shadowy figure again, and the tourists no longer reported feeling a presence. I believe that Lady Ravenswood's spirit found peace now that the truth was known. Working at Ravenswood Manor taught me that some spirits are bound to the places they died, unable to move on until their story is told. If you ever visit a haunted place, remember that the ghosts you encounter might just be looking for someone to listen and help them find peace. The Haunted Painting. My name is Emma, and I used to work at an art gallery that specialized in antique and rare paintings. The gallery was known for its collection of haunted paintings, but most people believed it was just a marketing gimmick to attract visitors. I was skeptical too, until I encountered the painting of Isabella. The painting was a portrait of a young woman with striking green eyes and long, flowing hair. It was said that the artist, a man named Henry, had been madly in love with Isabella, but she had died tragically before they could be together. Henry had poured his grief and longing into the painting, capturing her beauty and spirit in the most lifelike detail. When the painting arrived at the gallery, I was assigned to catalog it and prepare it for display. As I unwrapped it, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me. Isabella's eyes seemed to follow me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. That night, as I was closing up the gallery, I heard a soft, mournful singing. I followed the sound to the room where Isabella's painting was stored. The air was cold, and I could see my breath in the dim light. The singing grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the painting. I stood there, frozen in place, as Isabella's eyes seemed to come to life. They were filled with sorrow, and her lips moved, singing a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move, captivated by her sad, beautiful voice. The next day, I told my colleagues what had happened, but they laughed it off, saying it was just my imagination. I tried to believe them, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Whenever I was near the painting, I could feel Isabella's presence, and the singing would start again, soft and mournful. I decided to do some research on the painting and its history. I discovered that Henry had been so devastated by Isabella's death that he had taken his own life shortly after completing the portrait. It was said that his spirit was bound to the painting, forever mourning the loss of his beloved. I wanted to help Isabella and Henry find peace, but I didn't know how. One evening, as I was alone in the gallery, I heard the singing again. I approached the painting and spoke to it, asking Isabella and Henry what they needed. To my surprise, the singing stopped, and I felt a warm, comforting presence. I saw a faint, ghostly figure of Henry standing next to the painting, his eyes filled with sadness and longing. He reached out to touch the painting, and I heard his voice, soft and filled with emotion. "I just want to be with her," he said. "I just want to hold her again." I realized then that Henry's spirit was trapped because of his unfulfilled love for Isabella. I knew I had to find a way to reunite them. I reached out to a local medium, hoping she could help. The medium came to the gallery and performed a seance in front of the painting. As she chanted, the room grew cold, and I could feel the presence of both Henry and Isabella. The medium spoke to them, guiding them towards the light, helping them find each other in the afterlife. As the seance ended, I saw the ghostly figures of Henry and Isabella embrace, their faces filled with joy and peace. The air grew warm, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The painting no longer felt haunted, and the singing stopped for good. The gallery still has the painting of Isabella, but now it's just a beautiful portrait of a young woman with striking green eyes. The spirits of Henry and Isabella have found peace, and their love story has finally come to an end. Working at the gallery taught me that love can transcend even death, and that some spirits are bound by their emotions, unable to move on until they find closure. If you ever encounter a haunted object, remember that it might be holding the key to a love story that needs to be told. The Drowning Pool. My name is Mark, and I used to live near a secluded lake that was known for its clear waters and serene beauty. The locals called it the Drowning Pool because of the number of mysterious drownings that had occurred there over the years. I never believed the stories until I had my own encounter with the lake's dark secret. One summer, my friends and I decided to go for a late-night swim. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the water. We were having a great time, laughing and splashing around, when I noticed something strange. The water near the center of the lake seemed darker, almost like a shadow was moving beneath the surface. Curiosity got the better of me, and I swam towards the shadow. As I got closer, I felt a sudden chill, and the water seemed to pull me down. I struggled to stay afloat, but it was like something was dragging me under. My friends saw me struggling and swam over to help, but the force was too strong. Just when I thought I was going to drown, the pull stopped, and I was able to swim back to shore. I was shaken and exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried to drown me. My friends were spooked too, and we decided to leave. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the lake. I started having nightmares about being pulled underwater by ghostly hands. I decided to do some research and discovered that the lake had a dark history. Several people had drowned there over the years, and their bodies were never recovered. I became convinced that the lake was haunted by the spirits of those who had drowned. I wanted to help them find peace, but I didn't know how. One night, I went back to the lake alone, hoping to communicate with the spirits. I stood by the shore and called out to them, asking what they wanted. The water remained still, but I felt a cold breeze, and I heard whispers like voices carried on the wind. They were pleading for help, begging to be released from the lake's grip. I knew I had to find a way to free them, but I didn't know where to start. I reached out to a local historian who told me about an old legend. It was said that the lake was cursed by a woman who had drowned there centuries ago. She had been betrayed by her lover, and her spirit had cursed the lake, trapping the souls of anyone who drowned there. The historian suggested performing a ritual to break the curse. I gathered the necessary items and went back to the lake. As I performed the ritual, the water began to churn, and I could hear the voices of the trapped spirits growing louder. Suddenly, a ghostly figure emerged from the water. It was the woman who had cursed the lake, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. I spoke to her, telling her that her lover was long gone, and that she needed to let go of her anger. She seemed to listen, and the water grew calm. The voices of the trapped spirits faded, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The curse had been lifted, and the spirits were free. After that night, the drowning stopped, and the lake became a peaceful place once again. I still visit the drowning pool from time to time, but I never swim in it. The memory of that night, and the spirits I helped release, will stay with me forever. The Forgotten Asylum. My name is Jack, and I used to be a paranormal investigator. I've seen my fair share of haunted places, but nothing compares to the time I spent at the old Ravenswood asylum. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, and it was said to be haunted by the spirits of the patients who had died there. One evening, my team and I decided to investigate the asylum. As we approached the building, we felt a heavy sense of dread. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the windows were boarded up, giving the place an ominous appearance. We made our way inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The hallways were lined with old, rusted beds and medical equipment, and the walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti. The place felt like it had been frozen in time, a relic of a forgotten past. As we explored the asylum, we started hearing strange noises, footsteps echoing through the halls, distant screams, and the sound of someone crying. We tried to capture the phenomena on our equipment, but the sounds were always just out of reach. We decided to split up to cover more ground. I went to the basement, where the most notorious stories originated. The basement was used as the asylum's morgue, and it was said to be the most haunted part of the building. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and I felt a sense of unease. The basement was pitch dark, and the only light came from my flashlight. I could see old, rusted gurneys and body lockers lining the walls. I started hearing whispers, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. I continued exploring, my flashlight flickering, as if the batteries were dying. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the presence of something sinister. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear a voice pleading for help. I realized that the spirits of the patients were trapped in the asylum, unable to move on. I wanted to help them, but I didn't know how. I started recording, hoping to capture their voices and find a way to communicate with them. As I listened to the playback, I heard a voice, clear as day, saying, "Free us." The voice was filled with pain and desperation, and it broke my heart. I knew I had to find a way to help them. I researched the history of the asylum and discovered that many of the patients had died due to neglect and abuse. The staff had treated them horribly, and their spirits were bound to the place, unable to find peace. I decided to hold a seance, hoping to communicate with the spirits and help them move on. I gathered my team, and we set up in the basement, lighting candles and forming a circle. We called out to the spirits, asking them to come forward. The air grew colder, and we could feel a presence in the room. The candles flickered, and we heard voices pleading for help. We asked the spirits what they needed, and they told us their story, how they had been mistreated, how they had suffered, and how they couldn't move on. We assured them that they were no longer alone, and that we would help them find peace. We performed a ritual to release their spirits, chanting and calling on the powers of the universe to free them from their torment. As the ritual ended, we felt a wave of energy pass through the room. The air grew warmer, and the sense of dread lifted. We could feel the spirits moving on, finding the peace they had been denied in life. After that night, the asylum felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the strange noises stopped. I believe we helped those spirits find peace, and it's an experience I'll never forget. The entity in the mirror. My name is Lucas, and I used to live in a small apartment in a historic building downtown. The place had its quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows, but it was affordable, and I liked the character of the old building. That was until I encountered something that changed my life forever. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home and decided to relax with a glass of wine. As I was unwinding, I noticed something strange about the old mirror in the hallway. It was a beautiful antique piece, a remnant from a bygone era, but tonight it felt different. The air around the mirror was colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. As I looked closer, I saw a faint figure reflected in the glass, standing behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I looked back at the mirror, but the figure was gone. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the mirror and the figure I had seen. The next day, I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades. She told me the mirror had a dark history. It had belonged to the building's original owner, a man named Charles, who had died under mysterious circumstances. It was said that his spirit was trapped in the mirror, unable to move on. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a story, but over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent. I would catch glimpses of the figure in the mirror, always standing just behind me, watching. The air around the mirror was always cold, and I started feeling a sense of dread whenever I walked past it. One night, I decided to confront the entity. I stood in front of the mirror and called out, asking who it was and what it wanted. The figure appeared again, more clearly this time. It was a man, his face twisted in anguish. "Help me," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. I was terrified, but I knew I had to do something. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the glass was freezing cold. I felt a surge of energy pass through me, and I saw visions of Charles's life, his joys, his sorrows, and finally, his tragic death. Charles had been murdered by a jealous rival, his spirit trapped in the mirror by a curse. He had been trying to communicate, seeking someone who could help him find peace. I knew I had to break the curse, but I didn't know how. I researched everything I could about curses and haunted objects. I found an old book of rituals and spells that might help. One evening, I sat up in front of the mirror, lighting candles and burning sage. I followed the instructions in the book, chanting and focusing my energy on breaking the curse. As I chanted, the mirror began to glow, and the figure of Charles appeared more clearly. He looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear. I continued the ritual, feeling the energy in the room grow stronger. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and the mirror shattered. I was thrown back by the force, and when I opened my eyes, the room was filled with a warm, comforting light. I could feel Charles's presence, no longer trapped or tormented. His spirit had been freed, and the sense of dread was gone. I cleaned up the broken glass and replaced the mirror with a new one. The apartment felt different, lighter, and more peaceful. I never saw Charles's spirit again, but I knew he was at peace. Living in that apartment taught me that some spirits are trapped by forces beyond our understanding, seeking help from those who can hear their pleas. If you ever encounter an entity in a mirror or any haunted object, remember that they might just be looking for someone to help them find peace. The Whispering Woods. My name is Ben, and I used to be an avid hiker. I loved exploring the wilderness, finding peace in the solitude of nature. One of my favorite places to hike was a dense forest known as the Whispering Woods. It was a beautiful, remote area with towering trees and winding trails. But it also had a dark reputation. The locals believed the forest was haunted, that people who ventured too deep into the woods would hear whispers and see apparitions. Many had gone missing over the years, their bodies never found. I never believed the stories, thinking they were just superstitions to keep people out of the woods. One autumn afternoon, I decided to hike deeper into the forest than I ever had before. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way along the trail. The deeper I went, the more I felt a strange sense of unease, but I brushed it off as my imagination. As the sun began to set, I realized I had wandered off the main trail. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the air grew colder. I decided to head back, but the forest had become disorienting, and I couldn't find my way. Then I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, like voices carried on the wind. I stopped, trying to listen, but the words were indistinguishable. I called out, thinking it might be other hikers, but there was no response. The whispers seemed to come from all around me, growing louder and more urgent. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I started to panic. I quickened my pace, trying to find the trail, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, leading me deeper into its depths. As darkness fell, the whispers turned into screams. I could hear voices crying out in pain and terror, and I saw shadowy figures moving between the trees. My heart raced as I stumbled through the forest, feeling like I was being watched. I came across an old, dilapidated cabin. Desperate for shelter, I ran inside and slammed the door behind me. The whispers were still there, echoing through the cabin, but I felt a momentary sense of safety. I searched the cabin for anything that could help me find my way out. In one of the rooms, I found a journal. It belonged to a man named Thomas, who had lived in the cabin years ago. His entries detailed his own encounters with the whispers and the apparitions, and how he had become lost in the woods just like me. Thomas wrote about a curse that had been placed on the forest by a vengeful spirit. The spirit had been wronged in life, and in death, it trapped the souls of those who ventured too deep into the woods. The journal ended abruptly, with Thomas pleading for someone to break the curse. I knew I had to find a way to break the curse if I wanted to escape. I continued reading, looking for clues. Thomas had written about a ritual that could be performed to free the trapped souls. It required a personal item from the spirit and an offering to appease it. I searched the cabin and found an old locket buried in the dirt floor. It belonged to the spirit, a woman named Eliza who had been wronged by the villagers and left to die in the woods. I took the locket and made my way back outside, hoping to find a way to perform the ritual. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the presence of the trapped souls around me. I found a clearing and set up for the ritual, using the locket and an offering of food and flowers. As I chanted the words from the journal, the air grew colder, and I felt a surge of energy. The whispers turned into screams, and I saw the apparition of Eliza appear before me. Her face was twisted in anger and sorrow, but as I continued the ritual, her expression softened. She reached out, and I placed the locket in her hand. There was a blinding flash of light, and the screams stopped. The forest grew silent, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The curse had been lifted, and the trapped souls were free. I found my way back to the main trail and made it out of the forest. I never went back to the Whispering Woods, but I'll always remember the spirits I helped release and the lesson I learned about the power of the unknown, the silent ones. My name is Sam, and I used to work as a night security guard at an old, abandoned factory. The factory had been shut down for years, but the owners kept it guarded to prevent vandals and squatters from taking over. It was a creepy place, with long, dark corridors and the constant sound of dripping water echoing through the halls. One night, I was making my rounds when I heard a strange noise coming from one of the old storage rooms. It sounded like whispering, but there was no one else supposed to be in the building. I thought it might be my radio picking up some interference, but when I checked, it was silent. I decided to investigate, thinking it might be a couple of kids who had snuck in. As I approached the storage room, the whispering grew louder. It was faint, like a conversation just out of earshot. I opened the door and shone my flashlight inside, but the room was empty. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. The walls of the room were covered in old, faded drawings. They depicted shadowy figures standing in various poses, all with their eyes closed and mouths open, as if they were screaming in silence. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. I closed the door and continued my rounds, but the whispering followed me. It seemed to come from the walls, growing louder and more insistent. I could hear voices, faint and distant, like a chorus of the damned. I went back to the security office and reviewed the surveillance footage, hoping to find an explanation. As I watched, I saw shadowy figures moving through the corridors, their eyes closed and mouths open in silent screams. They moved silently, almost gliding, and always just out of reach of the cameras. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The whispering never stopped, and the figures seemed to be everywhere. I couldn't escape them, no matter where I went. I tried to talk to my supervisor, but he dismissed it as stress and lack of sleep. One night, I decided to confront the figures. I went back to the storage room and called out, asking who they were and what they wanted. The whispering grew louder, and the shadowy figures appeared, surrounding me. I could feel their cold presence, and I knew they were trying to tell me something. I reached out to touch one of the figures, and I was hit with a wave of memories. I saw the factory in its heyday, filled with workers. I saw accidents and tragedies, people getting hurt or killed. I realized that the figures were the spirits of those who had died in the factory, trapped and unable to move on. I wanted to help them, but I didn't know how. I spent weeks researching, trying to find a way to free them. I found an old ritual that could release trapped spirits, but it required a personal item from each spirit. I went back to the factory and started searching. I found old tools, pieces of clothing, and other items that had belonged to the workers. I gathered them all and performed the ritual, hoping to free the spirits. As I chanted, the whispering grew louder, and the figures appeared again. They surrounded me, their eyes still closed and mouths open in silent screams. I could feel their pain and sorrow, and I knew they wanted to be free. Suddenly, there was a bright light, and the figures began to fade. The whispering stopped, and the air grew warmer. I felt a sense of peace, knowing that the spirits were finally free. After that night, the factory felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the strange occurrences stopped. I left my job as a security guard, but I'll always remember the silent ones and the night I helped them find peace. The dollmaker's curse. My name is Liam, and I used to live in a small town known for its charming, historic buildings and quirky local shops. One of the most famous shops was an old dollmaker store, filled with handmade dolls that were both beautiful and eerie. The shop had been closed for years, but the dolls remained, gathering dust in the windows. One day, I was walking past the shop when I noticed something strange. One of the dolls, a delicate porcelain figure with bright blue eyes, seemed to be staring directly at me. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off as a trick of the light and continued on my way. That night, I had a nightmare. I was in the dollmaker's shop, surrounded by the dolls. They were all watching me, their eyes following my every move. I tried to leave, but the door was locked. The dolls started whispering, their voices growing louder and more insistent. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll with the blue eyes was watching me. I decided to investigate and asked around about the dollmaker's shop. The locals were hesitant to talk, but I eventually found out that the shop had been owned by a man named Mr. Whittaker. Mr. Whittaker was known for his exquisite dolls, but he had a dark reputation. It was said that he had lost his daughter in a tragic accident and had become obsessed with making dolls that looked like her. He poured all his grief and love into his creations, but some believed he had also cursed them with his sorrow. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to visit the abandoned shop. The door was locked, but I managed to find a broken window and climbed inside. The air was thick with dust, and the room was filled with rows of dolls, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. As I explored the shop, I felt a strange presence. The dolls seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every move. I found the doll with the blue eyes sitting on a shelf, its gaze fixed on me. I picked it up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a soft whisper. It was faint, but I could make out the words, "Help us." The voice was filled with pain and desperation, and I knew it was coming from the doll. I realized that Mr. Whittaker's sorrow had trapped the spirits of the dolls, binding them to the shop. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. I decided to take the doll with me and try to find a way to break the curse. That night, the nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. I saw Mr. Whittaker, his face twisted in grief, and I heard the dolls whispering, begging for release. I reached out to a local historian who told me about an old ritual that could free trapped spirits. It required a personal item from the person who had cast the curse and an offering of flowers and candles. I knew I had to find something that had belonged to Mr. Whittaker. I went back to the shop and searched through the old belongings. I found a locket with a picture of Mr. Whittaker and his daughter. It was the perfect item for the ritual. I gathered the flowers and candles and set up in front of the dollmaker's shop. As I performed the ritual, the air grew colder, and I felt a presence around me. The dolls seemed to come to life, their eyes glowing with a strange light. I chanted the words, focusing on breaking the curse and freeing the spirits. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and the dolls began to glow. I could see the spirit of Mr. Whittaker, his face filled with sorrow and regret. He reached out to his daughter, and their spirits embraced, finally finding peace. The doll's eyes grew dim, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that the spirits were free. I left the doll in front of the shop as a sign that the curse had been broken. After that night, the nightmares stopped, and the dollmaker's shop felt different. The eerie presence was gone, and the dolls were just lifeless toys once more. I'll always remember the dollmaker's curse and the spirits I helped release.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling content.